Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode number 226, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/226. And this week, returning to the show, I have Prof. CJ of the Dangerous History podcast. Welcome back.
Hey, good to be back with you.
Yeah, glad to have you. And one of the main things why I wanted to have you back on is because you have embarked upon this gigantic project, which you are prone to do. Excellent projects you do there, CJ. But this one is about World War I propaganda, and this is a topic that I've covered a little bit on the show as well. So I wanted to, well, first off, why don't you just kind of remind the audience who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I got a master's degree in history, and I've been teaching college history for 15 years now, I think. And for the last 8 years, I've also been doing a podcast I started called the Dangerous History Podcast. And I've covered all sorts of different history topics over the years, mostly American history, just because that's most of my audience is American. But I've covered all sorts of other stuff too here and there. And so that's what I do. And, looking at history basically from libertarian anarchist sort of a perspective, which obviously is, when you look at history through that lens, it looks very different than if you're looking at history through kind of the typical center left, center right establishment kind of lens, which, a lot of it is just propaganda for the state and hagiography of various politicians and whatever like that. But the way I think about it is that the lenses through which you look at a topic like history are going to reveal different things, depending on what sort of lenses you're using. And the way I think of it, because I was a kid in the 80s when they still knew how to make good action movies. And if anybody has ever seen the movie Predator, there's the scene where they're showing you like through the Predator's point of view, and he's like making adjustments to his helmet visor or whatever. And so, each way he switches it, he can see different things, in each lens. Some things are revealed, but others are maybe, hidden. But anyway, so yeah, when you flip on your lenses of being, skeptical of the state and corporate elites too, very often people like that, things just look very different. It's a very different story.
I got my English degree. My bachelor's degree is English, was with a focus in creative writing, but through all the course readings and the foundational classes they had you take, they talked a lot about viewing things through those lenses. But to me, it was always a gender lens, or these Marxist kind of delineations, like a gender lens or class struggle or race, things like that. And so it's refreshing to get, someone like you who, you're a professor yourself, like you said, and having the master's degree to present the other side of this whole thing, something that doesn't have to do with these putting people in boxes and having this conflict going on. And one of my favorite things that you've done was your American history, or your American Revolution series, and that actually came up in an episode I did a couple weeks ago, talking about the Declaration of Independence. And I just wanted to ask, did you rely a lot on Conceived in Liberty when you did that, or was there other pieces that you relied on?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the sources that I looked at. I had a whole big pile of books,
sure,
though, and off the top of my head, I'm probably not going to remember very many of them, but because I think I made that series like 6 or 7 years ago now.
Yeah.
But I had actually, because I've always been interested in the Revolutionary War and everything that kind of goes along with it, and I had amassed, just by being, I did a graduate level course on colonial and revolutionary America when I was in graduate school. And I think I had also done a senior seminar when I was an undergrad on American Revolution. And so through that, and then just through kind of staying plugged into the field once I started teaching, I was aware of a bunch of really good books that are written by, establishment historians, basically, people who taught at the Ivy League universities and things like this, on the American Revolution, that were nonetheless quite radical and libertarian, at least in their implications. And so, like, these are by historians that, like, they themselves, I really doubt are anything but a typical kind of academic in terms of their ideology. But they're honest historians. They're not, trying to propagandize for their point of view. And so just by being an honest historian, some of them write books that have these very radical implications. So I'm trying to think of
it's like Bernard Bailyn. Was he one of them?
Oh yeah. Bernard Bailyn has some different books that are like that. Gordon Wood has some books with some pretty radical implications. Trying to think. Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fisher is another one that's because that one is just really a detailed chronicle of the whole story of the outbreak of the war and, Paul Revere's Ride and the battles of Lexington and Concord. It's just a very, accurate, well done kind of narrative. It's not a typical history monograph. It almost reads like a novel in a lot of places. But, when you read it, it's like you can't help but be struck by the fact that this was a grassroots bottom-up insurgency. Another good one that came out much more recently that I relied on for a lot of my take on the earlier phases of the resistance and then the rebellion was American Insurgents, American Patriots by T.H. Breen. And again, T.H. Breen, as far as I know, is a very kind of, in his own personal politics. He's not a radical. He's not a libertarian. He's probably a typical center-left, but he's a very good historian. So, that's one of the things I think that I'm able to contribute is, I do look at the stuff by actual radical libertarians like a Murray Rothbard for sure. He wrote a lot of great history, but one of the things is too, because I did come through the academia mill and I've been working in it for so long that I'm aware that there are books, published by Yale University Press or whatever, written by some professor emeritus at Harvard that actually do have some very radical implications that maybe the author, the historian himself, doesn't even quite fully realize the implications of his own. But I'm able to kind of put it together and go, oh, look at another one. This actually is only partially related to the American Revolution, although it gives a lot of like the deep backstory going back to British history. Is there's a book that's very interesting that I've recommended a bunch of times called Inventing the People. And it's by Edmund Morgan, who's another guy. He's been dead for a while now, but he's another guy who was like, at Yale or Harvard or someplace for decades and, was like considered perhaps the top establishment historian of academia of colonial and revolutionary America. And this book, Inventing the People, is basically an indictment of the whole idea of representative democracy as it evolved first in England and then in North America as basically being a scam. And what he says is like this whole thing is a fiction designed so that a small kind of iron law of oligarchy thing where this whole fiction of, they represent the people and the will of the people and all that is a fiction that allows a small elite group to run things while most of the people believe the fiction that like, no, this is government of, by, and for the people. And that's a very radical book, but I have no reason to believe that Edmund Morgan himself was a radical at all in his personal views. So yeah, there's a lot of books like that I've just come across over the years. And so, I'm able to kind of bring that in. It's always cool when, I love to cite Rothbard and whatever, but man, when you can cite some like, highly award-winning professor emeritus from Yale, maybe that shouldn't carry more weight, but it does. And you're able to say like, oh no, here's this very, very middle of the road ideologically establishment historian. And actually he's pointing out some things that are pretty radical in their implications if you think about it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it adds more clout to the argument. And you were going back about the implications of democracy in that one piece you were talking about. Is that kind of dovetail off of Alex de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America? Because if I remember correctly, like his thesis was that, well, this is eventually going to fall apart, wasn't it, de Tocqueville?
Yeah, it's been long enough since I last read Inventing the People. I don't remember if he ever mentions Tocqueville or not. I think he's got a little bit different of a take as far as, whether representative democracy can work in the long run or not. My recollection is that Tocqueville seems to have focused on, and it's a giant, complicated book with a lot of different things going on, but I think Tocqueville keyed in on the decentralization and localism of American democracy as being why it seems to work better and not have as many negative aspects as, say, French revolutionary democracy, which was very much, about centralization. And I don't think that Edmund Morgan really got into the question of centralization versus decentralization and whether that's, better or worse for democracy. But Tocqueville has that very sorry, getting over being sick. Tocqueville has that very interesting passage that I love to quote where he talks about how tyranny could come about in a democratic system like America's. And it's very interesting that passage because it almost reminds me of when George Carlin famously said, when democracy comes to America, it's not going to be swastikas and goose stepping. It's going to be smiley face shirts and Nike shoes or something like that. It's going to look benevolent to most people. It's not going to look like these big scary guys with death's head belt buckles. And when you read that one passage from Tocqueville, it's very similar. He's like, no, they're not going to take over like an old school, ancient dictator or despot, as he says. That tyranny will come to America in this very kind of like soft sort of a way that'll just gradually, the way he describes it, it's almost like that whole concept of nudging that Cass Sunstein talks about. It's just gonna very, very gently and just little piece by little piece. It's going to just slowly, take away your ability to make decisions in your own life. And he says it will result in a system that will be, trying to remember what he says. That'll have the appearance of democracy, but in reality will be super authoritarian. So yeah,
that should
a little bit of tangent.
No. Well, I mean, that should ring true for everyone now because I've said in a lot of ways, I don't think we would ever see substantial change, bottom up change from the people or get people to care about what's going on until it starts to affect their daily lives. And where it affects their daily lives are the prices at the grocery store, the prices at the gas pump. And we've seen that. But we have yet to see exactly what that's going to look like, in terms of people actually making changes.
Yeah. And what I think of when I read that passage from Tocqueville, and he talks about how, it's if tyranny comes to America, it's not going to look the same as it has in other times and places. I actually think of somebody like, even though obviously he's Canadian, but I think of Trudeau. Like Trudeau to me is the much more likely sort of a dictator to come about in a modern, Western society. It's not going to be some guy screaming at the top of his lungs and goose stepping and sig heiling who's like obviously, deranged a bit or whatever. It's going to be someone who sounds very nice and smooth, and he's just here to help you. He's just here to keep you safe. It's not going to be some guy ranting and raving and whatever. I don't think anyway.
Yeah. Well, To transition just a little bit here, I want to, ask you about you have part 1 of your new documentary series coming out on World War I. And in a lot of ways, maybe that chronicles the nudging in a certain direction. But can I ask you, what made you want to do this series? I know you've kind of been working your way through history, but is there any specific current events that turned you on to this topic?
Yeah, well, I've been interested in propaganda in history for a long time. I actually took a graduate seminar on on modern propaganda in history, and wrote a pretty big, I forget, 20, 30 page original research paper having to do with propaganda. So, I've studied it a lot in both theory and practice. I've read all the main books, Jacques Ellul, Edward Bernays, all the others. And I had personally looked a lot into propaganda during World War One. And the two countries I had studied the most in terms of how they did it were the two countries that did it the most and did it the most effectively during the war. And most, pretty much all experts on World War One propaganda that I've ever read will say the government that did the most propagandizing and did it the most effectively during World War One, by a pretty good margin, was the British government. And that probably number two was the United States government, even though the U.S. was in the war for less than 2 years. So I was already pretty familiar with World War I propaganda. And in a lot of ways, World War I is, in my mind anyway, the real beginning of modern propaganda. Now, obviously, propaganda has existed since there have been, human societies and anything resembling governments. But it's in modern times that you get certain things coming together simultaneously. You get at least in the developed Western world, you get relatively widespread literacy for the first time ever. You also get, one after the other, a whole bunch of communications technologies coming along that allow like all new kinds of media for propaganda. So you get first the printing press, and then books and magazines and newspapers get cheaper and cheaper. And then so that kind of written propaganda gets much more widespread and available and inexpensive. And then gradually you start to get other things too, like motion pictures, and then eventually later radio, and obviously today we got a zillion other things around the internet. But World War I was the first really big war where you really had modern propaganda that could be pretty totalistic and could be carried out in a way that actually would reach the masses. Because, if in the 1500s you cranked out a bunch of written propaganda, let's say having to do with the wars of the Reformation, well, the only people who are going to ever receive your propaganda into their brains directly are going to be those who can actually read and comprehend it, and that's going to be a relatively small group of people. But by World War I, in a country like the US or UK, most people can at least basically read. And so, and you don't quite have radio yet, but you do have, early records, basically like phonographs and things. So you can have propaganda songs. You can have speeches be propaganda. And you're getting early motion pictures as well. There were World War I propaganda films that were made. And so, to me, World War I has always been one of the most interesting to study as far as modern propaganda, because it's the first really big war that happens when modern propaganda is possible in like a truly multimedia sense that will actually reach, the masses directly. And so a lot of the same basic techniques and narrative moves that they still use today in propaganda really first get used to their fullest extent during World War I. Now, they've gotten, more sophisticated in terms of the types of media they can use, and they've been able to refine some of how they do things for sure. But a lot of the basic narrative moves are the same ones because they keep working. So, why bother inventing new tricks, right? I mean, imagine if you're a magician who comes up with one really good trick, and for some reason, like, no one ever gets tired of it, right? Every single the 10,000th time you do the same trick, the audience is like just as flabbergasted and amazed, right? Yeah. Like, okay, why are you going to spend a whole bunch of time, tinkering in your basement trying to come up with a bunch of new tricks if that one just keeps like earning you millions of dollars and getting you standing ovations everywhere you go? So yeah, they don't need new tricks because the old ones keep working. And what made me specifically, something that I've studied for so many years, what made me specifically decide, all right, I need to do a podcast series about this, was actually the beginning of the COVID regime. Because I saw that a lot of the same propaganda techniques that you can find being used in World War I were being used, obviously in modified form, for COVID propaganda. And so that's what initially got me going on. All right, I really need to, like, this is World War I propaganda is actually a timely subject now. So I started working on that, and it was, over a year of intense research, just to give you, and the listeners a sense of like how much work goes into a podcast episode like that, the one that I put out so far in this series. It's a 5.5 hour podcast episode. It literally was years in the making, to be able to do something that long and that, deep of a dive. And then while I was already working on it under the inspiration of the COVID propaganda, then you have various other propaganda campaigns come out. A lot of the stuff related to Black Lives Matter and all the riots and stuff there. And then, some of these techniques you also saw being used in regard to the mainstream portrayal of the January 6th cosplay riot. And but then obviously the last whatever it is, 4 or 5 months, the Russian war with Ukraine, you see a lot of the same propaganda moves being used by the mainstream Western media that were used all the way back in World War I. And there's even the similarity of this first episode I did for any listeners who aren't familiar with it. The first episode I did in my series on World War I propaganda is actually about the British propaganda operation inside the United States during the almost 3 years that World War I was going on and America was not officially in the war. The British made it a priority from day one when the war started to get the U.S. into the war on their side no matter what. It was like their number one priority, because they knew that if they could get the U.S. to come into the war on their side, there's no way they could lose the war. Whereas without the U.S., it's a little more iffy. So they set up the British state set up a gigantic propaganda operation inside the United States aimed at an American audience. And basically my argument is that they're hijacking American public opinion in order to hijack American foreign policy, not for what's best for the American people. I don't think the American people had anything like a good reason to want to be involved in World War I, and most Americans didn't for a long time. That it was the British state hijacking the American people and the American state basically to help themselves out. And now, were there members of the American elite who already were pro-British and wanted to get into the war on their side for various reasons of their own? Yes. But as far as like the masses of regular Americans, most of them did not for a long time want to get into World War I. But the British, worked very hard on convincing Americans that this war actually was their business and they needed to get involved. And I see a very similar thing happening in regard to the Ukraine war, where the Ukrainian government has, most people don't know this unless they listen to shows like yours or listen to Scott Horton or somebody like that, where the Ukrainian government, long before Russia invaded in February, had been investing enormous amounts of money and resources into trying to influence the U.S. government and U.S. public opinion. I think it's in the months, maybe even longer, leading up to the Russian invasion, that Ukraine had actually invested more money into lobbying in the United States than either Israel or Saudi Arabia had during that same period. And Israel and Saudi Arabia are usually the two biggest in recent years of foreign governments trying to, hijack the U.S. government for their own purposes. And so, that's another similarity that I saw right off the bat is you've got the same scenario where an outside government is hijacking American foreign policy in just the ways that many of the founding fathers warned us against. And they're doing it with the willing collaboration of a lot of the American media and a lot of the American homegrown elites. And so it's this disturbingly similar thing. And, the U.S. eventually did get into World War I with disastrous consequences for world history ever since. And, obviously, if the U.S. ever does get directly involved in a war against Russia, things could go even worse. Thousands of nukes. I know Scott Horton recently put out a whole book just about this. Hey, remember Americans? There's still thousands of nukes out there that can wipe out life on Earth. So it's even higher stakes than the U.S. getting pulled into World War One. And at the end of the episode, or towards the end of the episode, I actually read a bunch from George Washington's farewell address, where what he talks about is just so eerily similar. What he's warning about, what he's predicting if Americans get pulled into other countries and other governments' wars and problems, is basically exactly what happened in regard to the U.S. in World War One, and it's pretty much exactly what's been happening so far in regard to the U.S. and the Ukraine war.
And that's something I wrote about a little bit in a piece called, it was like 105 years ago, The Psalm Still Echoes, where it was actually, I started writing a column because there was a columnist from Responsible Statecraft named George Beebe, who came out with a piece saying that those in power are ignoring the lessons of World War One and instead trying to follow the lessons from World War Two. But all of those lessons from World War One, are more on point because you have the danger of entangling alliances, and you have this danger of everything being lined up, blaming one side for a conflict. And you also have the lesson from the end of World War One, which is punishing so heavily the perceived instigator of the conflict itself. And again, all these qualifications that no, Putin should not have invaded Ukraine. We have to make those qualifications apparently, but you're ignoring a whole history of provocation and things that we've covered extensively on this show. So just go back and listen to those. But those lessons are right there, but instead they're pretending to learn the lessons from World War II, which is, Putin, Hitler, bad, basically.
Yeah. And, in some ways, I think Putin has more similarities to somebody like the Kaiser in World War One than he does to Hitler in World War II. Where he's not a great guy and, all that stuff. That said, he's not this uniquely singular evil villain, and that's to mention some of the particular narrative moves that were used in World War One propaganda that are being used now in regard to this war. One of them is you demonize the entire country who's the enemy, but you demonize their leader the most. You make their leader into this literal monster figure, this almost cartoonish supervillain. And it's crazy when you go back and look at how the Kaiser was portrayed in British and then American propaganda. They portrayed the Kaiser as being a literal monster. They portrayed him as being worse than what we would see later with Hitler. If what they were saying about the Kaiser was true, he would have been worse than Hitler. And nobody today thinks the Kaiser was even remotely close to being as bad as Hitler, So yeah, you demonize the people, then you demonize their leader the most as the archetype or epitome of the nation's evil. And as you were saying before, you craft a narrative of the origins of the war that is very carefully cherry-picked and curated. And one of the things that's most effective to do in propaganda is to actually keep outright lying and fabrication to a minimum. It always happens to some degree, but you don't want to flat out tell things that are just false too often. It's very risky. It can backfire. Things that can easily be, in the true sense of the term, fact checked and potentially be debunked. That's risky because if enough high profile things are obviously proven to be lies to the point where even the mainstream can't ignore it, that's going to make a lot of people very, very skeptical and cynical. So the better tactic most of the time is going to be to lie by omission, and basically combine that with cherry picking. And so you don't tell people things that are factually false. You tell people things that are factually true, but you very selectively choose which facts you share with them, and you only put together facts that support the narrative point you're trying to make about who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, who started this war, who deserves all the blame. And Meanwhile, you very carefully leave out of what you're telling people any facts that might be just as equally factually true, but that muddy the waters in any way that might complicate the narrative. So yeah, you talk about, oh, look, the Germans invaded Belgium. It's like, yeah, the Germans did invade Belgium, and that's not good. But if you leave out like all the entire rest of the context as to like the tensions and arms races building up to that for years, why they invaded Belgium, the fact that Belgium really wasn't as neutral as the Allies were saying in that war, things like that. And so, yeah, you say, oh, look, in February, Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine. That's bad. It's like, yeah, it is bad. And I'm not in favor of it. But, maybe we ought to drop the needle on the story at least as far back as 2014, if not even further, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that I've done a few times when a blue-pilled normie, including most academics, because most academics claim to be these left-wing like hippies in their heart who really don't like war, and yet they somehow manage to support virtually every war that comes along, at least initially. One thing I've done a few times to academics who are just, basically repeating the CNN CIA version of the narrative of the war is I'll say, what's your opinion about the 2014 coup in which the U.S. government sponsored overthrowing the sovereign democratic government of Ukraine, and replacing it with their own sock puppets that were, much more anti-Putin, anti-Russia. Like, what's your opinion of that? And it completely knocks them off balance because most of them don't even know that happened. And so it's like, it's almost like I've just started speaking to them in Esperanto or something like that. And, I have no way of knowing if that causes any of them to then later, Google the 2014 coup and Google the Minsk Accords and the degree to which those have not been adhered to by the Ukrainians and, all the other things. Like, I don't know, maybe they finish talking to me and they go right and flip on, CNN or whatever and just get their new talking points, and what the current thing is today. But, maybe a few of them, it's enough of like a pattern interruption sort of a move where, it's like a glitch in the matrix where they're like, oh, wait a minute. Wait, there's more to this story that I didn't know. So yeah, that's another thing, by the way, that I'm starting to do some research and thinking on is I've started to read a few different books having to do with like cults and mind control. And in particular, how do people get out of those things? How do people get, deprogrammed or pulled out of destructive cults? And a lot of these are books written by people who are, psychologists and things like that. And the reason I've started looking into that is because I'm trying to figure out what I can learn from that literature that can be useful to combating the effects of propaganda. Because propaganda is just like a slightly less extreme version of a lot of the techniques that cults use to indoctrinate their members and control their members and whatever. It's a lot of basically the same techniques, just the Jonestown people were doing it way more aggressively and in a way more over the top extreme way than say CNN does it. But anyway, I'm hopeful that I'll be able to put together some techniques, that I can use and other people can use when dealing with the just, heavily blue-pilled, because there's probably a certain percentage of people who are just so lost in the matrix that you really can't reach them. Just like there's probably a certain percentage of people who are so all in on a cult that like you really can't get them out. But I don't think that's everybody. And I think there's probably more people than you realize at first who are at least potentially reachable if you can figure out the right techniques. And the right techniques are not to just start, spouting off every libertarian talking point autistically. The techniques are probably things that are much more indirect and subtle, and less is more, and more about pulling than pushing. And one of the things I'm sort of thinking about is this whole idea of a pattern interruption, where you don't try and give someone the entire Scott Horton narrative of the Ukraine war, but if you can just like add, especially if you could do it as a question, right? And that's why I would phrase it as a question and be like, well, what's your opinion of the 2014 coup where the U.S. overthrew the Ukrainian government? Like, oh, you don't have an opinion. Well, that's interesting. I wonder why you've never heard of that.
Hey everybody, welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. It is at my new membership website, libertyweekly.club. And I know I've been announcing this, but I left Substack, rolled out a new membership website that operates the same way. You get content through your email address, but there's also a web page, libertyweekly.club, where you can go and read the articles. And it works really great so far. Just a couple of hiccups in terms of trying to figure out how to use free previews for people who are just signed up to the free newsletter. And for people who sign up through the membership here, you can see that right now I have a $5 a month tier that will get you access to early access to episodes of Liberty Weekly, access to bonus episodes that I've been trying to come out with 2 times a month, preprint access to all my Libertarian Institute articles before they're published, and I'm working on setting up a subscribers-only live stream. I'd like to do that before the end of the month, which I will announce through the email list. So if you go through, sign up for the email list, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button. You can choose the free tier or you could choose the $5 per month tier, which will get you access to the benefits. But for free content, there still is free content up there. Like I do a lot of article content there. So head on over to libertyweekly.club. The other thing that I'm really excited to announce is a collaboration between myself and Ludwig von Mises Pieces, which is the guy who does all my graphics and thumbnails, and the guy who, he does a ton of awesome work. So you can see Liberty Weekly merch is now available if you head on over to libertyweekly.net this time /merch, MERCH. You'll be able to find Liberty Weekly merch with my new logo with the rising sun and Lady Liberty holding the shield and flag. I really like the logo that he was able to do for me. And you can see that you can get coffee mugs there. You can get sweatshirt. You can get t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. The other collaboration. Oh, and if you use promo code LW10, that will get you 10% off. And it will also get a kickback to me and show him that you bought through my link. But you could also go through all the other merchandise that he has there. There's lots of good stuff. You buy anything in the store with promo code LW10, and I will also get a kickback. You can see a bunch of stickers and T-shirts and designs that people in our sphere of the Liberty movement will just love. All that the merch that he has there. It's original stuff that he's made himself. And we did a collaboration on a T-shirt, that idea that I had. Dissolve NATO, super timely right now, but for those of you just listening to the audio version only, it's the NATO logo that is being shattered into a million pieces, and it says Dissolve NATO on it. So I think it's a really cool, timely T-shirt. Of course, it was an idea that I'd commissioned, and I think that he did an awesome job with it. And if you like my thumbnails and logo art, Ludwig von Mises Pieces did Why I Am Anti-War podcast logo, which is a dove coming out of a helmet. And I really, really like that logo too. So check out this Dissolve NATO. You can get it in sticker format. You can get it on a sweatshirt or a t-shirt. And I'm going to be picking some of these up myself because I think they turned out really awesome. So again, head on over to libertyweekly.net /merch. And to get the NATO t-shirt, head on over to libertyweekly.net /NATO, NATO. All right, so that's all the stuff I got for you guys this week. Thanks everyone for subscribing, all the members at libertyweekly.club. Really appreciate it. You really help me afford all the hosting costs and to upgrade my equipment and all that kind of stuff too. So, all right, thanks. Peace. That's like Larkin Rose, back when I was first getting into this stuff in like 2017, Larkin Rose had a really interesting seminar that he called Candles in the Dark. And the whole idea of this was, you're not going to convince someone to be a libertarian anarchist overnight. But what your goal is really is to plant a splinter in their mind that will cause them to work over it. And if they care, I guess maybe you make the pre-assumption that they care about consistency in some way. But you really put that splinter in their mind that they'll think about for weeks and maybe revisit. And hopefully that will cause them to re-examine their position.
Yeah. And I think like attempting to dominate in terms of like a debating way, when like a Ben Shapiro owns a dumb millennial video or whatever.
Yeah.
That can be fun and gratifying, and it can be useful from the point of view of if you have an audience of people who are not, who are maybe neutral or undecided or only loosely have opinions, and they see you just completely obliterate someone in like a debate sort of an exchange, that might be useful in terms of them. But if you're actually trying to reach the person you're conversing with, if you come into it more like a debate, you're likely to provoke the backfire effect psychologically and cause them to be defensive and maybe even double down on their faulty beliefs. Whereas, if you come into it much more, less is more, like, oh, here's a little seed, and then step back, so to speak. And because I know a lot of times when I've changed my mind about something that I used to deeply believe, that it never or virtually never happens in like one exchange or conversation. It's actually usually a gradual, slow thing. And it's usually like there's one or two things that kind of just, cause that little bit of friction, that little bit of itch in your brain. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then gradually over time, you do your own thinking. And, it's always more effective to, as much as possible, allow people to persuade themselves that you're right, than to try and bludgeon them with it.
Or make it think that it's their idea that they're having, not that you're putting it there.
Yeah. Inception.
Right. Yeah. So that pattern interruption, and then, and I've thought of myself in the role that I play and what I do over the years, and I've become less and less of like trying to reach out to the other side and just focusing on what my work is. And I've become better at noticing when it's worthwhile to engage and when it's not. Like I had someone comment on this last week's video was about the fake China threat. And they were saying, as libertarians, it's our responsibility to promote human rights across the world. And, China's the biggest threat in the world to human rights. And we need to remove Xi from power. And I'm just like, okay, I just put a yawn emoji. And it's like, you don't engage with people like that. You're never going to win the argument or convince them of anything otherwise. It's like, that is a lost cause.
Yeah. I think of it sort of like triage where, if let's say you're a first responder in the aftermath of a disaster, or you're, a military medic or whatever, and you're trying to deal with all these horribly wounded people, you don't want to waste your time and resources and efforts on someone who's pretty much not going to make it no matter what you do. Right. You want to figure out where is your effort most likely to actually be effective and valuable. And for sure. I mean, that's one of the things I think any of us who have been in the libertarian milieu for a while, we all kind of go through that journey, that arc, which is similar to what people often go through when they, convert to a religion, or when they, whatever, become a vegan, join AA, whatever, where initially you're so fired up with evangelical zeal for your belief system or your cause or your organization, that you can't, and especially this tends to, I think young men in particular are just very prone to this, even more so than other people, where you just become this, insufferable autistic zealot.
Right.
As Winston Churchill says, bad guy, but quite a way with words. Something like, what did he say? He's got one of his many quotes is something like, a fanatic is someone who can't change their mind and won't change the subject.
Yeah.
So, you're not going to convert people to your cause most of the time by just being a relentless, belligerent evangelical zealot for it.
Yeah.
So some people never quite get out of that phase, unfortunately. But I think most people, sooner or later, they get to where, they're comfortable and confident in their beliefs to where they don't feel the need to engage every single idiot who's got a different point of view.
Yeah. And if you want a good example of the zealot evangelical, just go back to the early episodes of this podcast. If you go back in the archives or just type in libertyweekly.net / like, I don't know, 20 or something like that. But I wanted to point out, Prof. CJ, our last interview that we did, the first one I had you on the show, was May 25th, 2021. And we discussed the similarity between the World War I propaganda missions and the COVID regime. So in some way, some small way, if I could claim some credit for you embarking upon this mission, I definitely am doing it right now.
Wow, that's right. I had forgotten that was what we talked about.
Yeah. Well, and for those of you listening to the audio version, that's libertyweekly.net / 167. But I thought that was it was a great conversation. I mean, I think we touched on a lot of the stuff. You know, we talked about the American Revolution, of course, and then the fourth turning, which you had done an episode about at that time. I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. It's a little bit terrifying because I think that, and I forget which one of the authors of that is still alive, but the other one died a while ago. And one of the criticisms that some people have made, including me, is that the surviving guy, I forget if it's Strauss or Howe, that he hasn't really like changed his model in light of events that have happened since they published that book.
I see.
So some of the stuff that they predicted as far as how this fourth turning, which they would say that we're in, is going to play out, to me just seems ridiculous. Like, well, one of the issues that I have is they're a little bit too they stick a little bit too rigidly, I think, to their sort of model and their script of how these things play out. And so they're ultimately optimistic that after the fourth turning, you get into what they call the high, that things will be great. And I don't know if you're always guaranteed that that's going to be the case. And you could even argue like, well, you know, how great was the post-Civil War, quote unquote, high anyway, for a lot of the American people, right? But I worry on a number of levels that this fourth turning, if that is indeed, you know, what we're kind of into now, is more dangerous and scary than any fourth turning so far, for a number of reasons. One of them is there weren't nuclear weapons in existence during any of the other fourth turning crisis periods they point to. So yeah, as horrific as World War II was, or the Civil War was, there weren't nukes. So there was no literal existential danger to life on Earth. To me, that makes it kind of different. Then there's other variables too, in particular, that I believe that the United States is essentially an empire in the midst of serious decline and probable collapse right now. Now, how long it takes and how it plays out and what replaces it, I have no idea. But the previous fourth turning periods in American history, the United States was not an empire in serious decline and collapse. And to me, that again makes it much more dangerous in terms of how it could play out than previous fourth turnings. And then the last one, and this kind of goes along with the empire in decline, the U.S. economy is in many ways in a much more precarious situation than it was in, you know, the 1930s and 40s, or that it was in the 1860s, or, you know, that it was during the American Revolution. And so when you combine all those things together, that nukes exist, that the entire system seems to be on the verge of collapse, and it's just a matter of exactly how and when, and the economy is in the most precarious position I think it's ever been in American history. I don't know. To me, it makes it a lot more difficult to be as like, oh, don't worry though, in like 10 years it'll all play out and everything will be great, you know. And the other thing I look at too is that during the fourth turning period, one of the things they talk about is that the kind of elder generation is going to perform this role of being like the sages, the wise elder leaders, the Mr. Miyagi, Gandalf sort of figures, and they're going to help guide the younger generations to the new tomorrow where everything is better and we enter a new high. And okay, if they're right about all that, then they're talking about the boomers.
Right.
And I don't see much evidence that, especially the politicians who come of the boomer class, are interested in or capable of performing that role that they describe of being the voice of wisdom and whatever. I look at, Joe Biden, and I did an episode, I think around when Biden, either when he got elected or when he got sworn in, and I called it gray champions because that's a term that Strauss and Howe used. It refers to a Nathaniel Hawthorne story, a short story about a Puritan founder coming back during a period of crisis in colonial New England to sort of, step up and save the day and tell the young people to get right. And in that podcast, I contrasted Ron Paul, who, I think could have been a great champion, because he actually had all the right ideas and the integrity of like how to make things better, and at least start to deal with some of our worst problems, versus Joe Biden, who is just like, not even, I don't think anything this guy has ever proposed is anything that would make any of our problems anything other than astronomically worse. It's like he just wants to hit the gas on like all the worst aspects of the current system. And so my conclusion was, Ron Paul was the great champion we really needed, but maybe because the American people, at least the majority, seem to be so just degraded, and, not very impressive people, to put it mildly, that Joe Biden maybe is the great champion we deserve. Maybe not you and I and your listeners as individuals. Maybe we deserve better. But as far as the masses of American people, because they've gone along with all this shit, they've tolerated all the wars and cheered them on, and they've been too lazy to do their research into like how an economy actually works and what screws it up. And it's like the idea that people like David Hume have, that at the end of the day, or Etienne de la Boétie, at the end of the day, on some level, most people get the government that they kind of deserve, in the sense that, like, collectively, maybe not all of them as individuals, but collectively, they've kind of allowed the system and the people running it to be what they are, without serious resistance for too long.
And it seems at this point in time, like to your point. My phone went off. Sorry. To your point, it seems like at this time we're just ramping up conflict in three major theaters. Like with the Iran nuclear deal being put on hiatus and not really getting any progress there, tensions seeming to ramp up with Iran, and then of course a proxy war on Russia's doorstep, and then now it seems like Nancy Pelosi actually is going to go through with her planned visit to Taiwan, and you have Mike Pompeo saying that he would like to join her, and then Republicans and Democrats in Congress encouraging her to go, and then Biden putting his hands up and says, well, I have no power to stop her. It really just seems like things are reaching a fever pitch, and I wrote a piece about how especially dangerous, like the very thing that causes the Taiwan crisis to escalate is diplomatic recognitions of Taiwanese sovereignty. And having your Nancy Pelosi being third in line for the presidency, go to Taiwan and meet with Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwanese president. It just is so worrisome that everything is going to kick off at one time. It's just crazy.
Yeah. Our current, quote unquote, elite class, the current generation of elites, there's some of the previous generations of the American power elite were, often nefarious and did bad things and, used the system for their own personal power and profit and helping their buddies and, all that stuff. But a lot of them were at least relatively competent in what they were doing and at least had some understanding of like strategy. And the current generation, it's like they're as corrupt and evil, maybe even more so than previous generations of the American elite, but they're like way dumber and more reckless and just completely strategically clueless. Like Henry Kissinger has lately been the voice of reason a lot of the time. Okay. Henry Kissinger is the guy who's like, maybe you ought not simultaneously provoke the hell out of Russia and China and drive them into each other's arms. It's like, yeah, like Henry Kissinger is a bad dude who did bad things, but he at least had some understanding of strategy. He at least understood, like, you don't want Russia and China to be united against you if you can help it. Whereas the people in charge now, they're like, it's like they're trying to unite Russia, China, Iran, a bunch of other countries against them. It's just a bewildering degree of just recklessness and strategic cluelessness that I can't even wrap my brain around.
Yeah, and it really seems like the whole point of the rapprochement between the United States and China, when we went on this track of the one China policy, not recognizing Taiwan's sovereignty, the whole point of it was to further drive the wedge between Russia and China, and that seems like that's what the policy was supposed to be for the next, I guess, 10 years until the Soviet Union collapsed, and then I guess you don't have that problem anymore, right? Not sure, but. Another thing I wanted to focus on, and I want to give you a little time to talk about your campaign here to go full time with Dangerous History. But the other role, going back to World War I, you said one of the first things that happened when the war began was that the telegraph wires connecting the United States to Germany were cut, and these were the undersea cables. And I thought that was an interesting parallel, and indeed there's a great many, but a parallel between. As soon as this conflict started, you saw the demonization of Russian media or people who are portraying the other side of this conflict, or at least, we just had a list come out. I think it was from Ukraine, from the Ukrainian ministry, labeling the United States top Russian propaganda agents, and a lot of them were some sitting. Well, it was Tulsi Gabbard, a bunch of people who are published at antiwar.com. And I don't know if you just want to talk a little bit about isolating the discussion.
Yeah. Well, propaganda is always going to be most effective if you can silence or at least minimalize and marginalize anybody who's raising, contrary points of view or pointing out, facts that complicate the narrative or whatever like that. And that's definitely silencing those people when you can, especially if you can do it in a way that's not obvious. And that's why censorship in a way is so much more effective now, because it can be done silently and invisibly, by social media companies just, banning certain people, or even just more subtle things like juking the algorithms and that sort of thing. You can censor invisibly. One of the things that happened during World War I in the U.S. that I'm going to cover in later episodes in that series is that the government was often very heavy-handed in a way they haven't been since most of the time, where they did a lot of like obvious, blatant top-down censorship, including arresting thousands of Americans for giving speeches or publishing things that the government didn't like under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And that was bad optics, because that was something like that people could see. And so when people can see, federal marshals just locked up, an activist for giving a speech, that turns a lot of people off to the government in general. A lot of people, even people who maybe didn't agree with that activist, are like, wait a minute, I thought this was the land of the free and we have the First Amendment. That something is wrong. And so I think that the American elites learned that lesson from World War I, that you can't be too ham-fisted and obvious with your censorship. At least now, occasionally you might do something, heavy-handed to kind of flex a little bit and make an example of somebody. But you don't want to over-rely on heavy-handed censorship. It's better if you can do it invisibly. And so, yeah, the British, destroying the German telegraph cables to the U.S. was just a master move, where that meant they had, the Germans still had ways to get information to the U.S. and whatever, but I mean, that just, cut off most direct German communication with the U.S. And when you combine that with everything else, the language difference, the fact that most of the American elite were already pro-British anyway, the fact that most of the biggest American media outlets were already pro-British anyway, just meant that the British had complete dominance and hegemony over the information coming into the U.S. about what was going on in World War One. So yeah, definitely very similar in the way that they've silenced, not only Russian sources, but like you said, even, American sources who, like, a rational person who's being honest and not being disingenuous and not being a propagandist. Like, you would look at somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, and regardless of what you think about her point of view, like, she's not a the idea that she's a Russian asset, as Hillary Clinton actually said, is as absurd as actually believing that Trump was a Russian asset. It's like, it's just so preposterous. Again, like, you may not like these people, you may not agree with what they're saying, but to just, and so it's obviously a disingenuous smear designed to just make someone so toxic that no one will even listen to what they have to say. And that's why they love that move of, if they can't just flat out silence someone directly, they will smear them and destroy their reputation, because they can't, if that person is actually raising valid information and making valid arguments, well, then you can't engage their arguments, because people might actually, be convinced by what they have to say. And so that's why it's always a lot more, a lot more tactically smart to just kill the messenger, to just attack them. And yeah, that's one of the oldest moves there is. I mean, you can even go back before World War One, and when in the years leading up to the U.S. Going to war against Spain in the 1890s, one incident I like to refer to and quote a lot is, you had Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the most powerful pro-war voice in the U.S. Congress. He was a senator at the time, a Republican from Massachusetts. And then you had the Speaker of the House, who was also a New England Republican, a guy named Thomas Brackett Reed. I think he was from Maine. And these guys, they were two of the top Republicans in the Congress. They're both New Englanders. They, were, as far as I can tell, pretty friendly personally, had worked together on a number of things, and probably agreed on the vast majority of domestic policy questions. But Henry Cabot Lodge was rabidly pro-war, and Thomas Brackett Reed was against the war with Spain. He thought it was unjustified and didn't want to get involved. And so here's two guys that otherwise are friendly with each other, normally respect each other, and yet in an exchange in the Congress, Thomas Brackett Reed spoke out against going to war with Spain, and Henry Cabot Lodge's response was something like, "I'm sorry to see that your crazy pro-Spain sympathies are warping your otherwise wonderful mind." Like that's, so even two guys who were friends of the same party agreed on most things, but, oh, you're against the war we're trying to get started. Well, I guess you must be pro-Spain, right? So, when Hillary Clinton accused Tulsi Gabbard of being a Russian asset, that's just that same move. And as with so many of these narrative moves, whether it's demonizing the enemy people, demonizing their leader, giving one-sided versions of where a particular war came from and who's to blame, smearing people who don't go along with the narrative, it's another old trick they keep using because it works most of the time. So yeah, I mean, it's there's a meme I sometimes post, and it's like two guys sitting talking, little cartoon bubbles above them, and one of them, I think it's like an older looking guy with a beard, like a wise old man, says to the younger guy, "Those who don't read history are condemned to repeat it. Those who do read history are condemned to sit and watch as other people repeat it."
Yeah.
So yeah, and unfortunately we can be dragged in. Like, if they destroy the economy, unfortunately we're part of the collateral damage. Or if they start World War III, those of us who didn't want to start World War III can't just fly to the moon and sit it out, and not be affected by it. That to me is the tragedy, that the people who keep doing the same things that are horrible, that have been done for centuries or millennia, sometimes they don't bear any of the responsibilities for the stupid things and evil things that they do. Or if they do, the people who didn't want to do those things and who actually understand the lessons of history, very often bear some of the collateral damage of those people's stupid and evil things. So yeah, to really understand history in a true sense is kind of a curse, because you can see a lot of these things coming before they do. And to some degree, it's true also if you understand correct economics. You can see a lot of things coming, and you can try to do little things to insulate yourself and your family or whatever as much as you can, but like there's a certain degree of man-made disaster that like you can't fully protect yourself from in all cases. So I'm sure you were in the same boat. Probably most people listening are in the same boat where at the start of the COVID regime, it's like, oh yeah, of course there's going to be horrific inflation down the road, because they literally forcibly shut down huge sectors of the economy and simultaneously created trillions of dollars out of thin air and flooded it into the economy. It's like, how could this not create massive price inflation in coming years? And then the same thing, I predicted some of the erosions of civil liberties that would come out of the COVID regime. I said very early on, especially once I had information to realize, the virus was nowhere near as deadly as they wanted you to think it was. Pretty early on, that was clear to anyone who was looking at it objectively. And pretty early on, I was like, yeah, I'm much more worried about the government's responses to COVID than I am about the virus itself, because I think that's going to do a lot more damage and probably ultimately end a lot more lives than the virus, this particular virus anyway, ever could. So, and unfortunately I was right. So yeah, to be an honest historian and to be an honest economist is in some ways to be, what's the figure from Greek mythology? I think it's Cassandra, who her superpower was, she could predict the future. She could see the future, but the flip side, the sort of Twilight Zone curse to it was no one would ever believe her. So that's kind of how I've been feeling really for a long time, but especially the last couple of years.
Yeah, I remember in 2020, I told my paralegal at the time that, because they were with the CARES Act, they were printing all this money. I said, inflation's going to hit. It's going to be, staple goods at the grocery store are going to be incredibly expensive. I think I said milk to $6 a gallon, which I don't know if that's happened yet, but that was my example. But Prof. CJ, you are embarking upon this mission to get yourself full-time with the Dangerous History podcast. I think as we were talking, your goal was reached. I don't know if you know about this. But people can still go to your Indiegogo campaign to get you full time. You got some awesome perks there on the side. People can look through that. When this episode drops, there will still be a few days that you can contribute to the campaign. But do you want to talk about that quick? And is there a short link that people can find this campaign and support you?
Yeah, actually, the short link I have is from Tom Woods, because Tom was kind enough to have me on near the start of the campaign to help me promote it. And so if anybody just puts in tomwoods.com/CJ, tomwoods.com/CJ, that'll actually take you to my Indiegogo page for the campaign. And yeah, I just happened to look up on my phone just before you started talking about it that, yeah, apparently during this conversation, I busted past my goal of 12,000. So, I would urge people, if they want to support my work and help me out, please keep giving, because I can use all the help I can get. This is, I've been doing the Dangerous History podcast as a side project and a side hustle for 8 years now. And, I'm taking a leap here. I'm walking away from a job I've been at for around 15 years that, doesn't pay great, but it does pay steady and it does have decent benefits. And, I'm walking away from that to do the Dangerous History podcast and some other things I've got on the docket full time to be full time independent content creator. My plan is to also start a second podcast, do some other projects related to the Dangerous History podcast, write some books, a number of other things. And yeah, this campaign is to basically help cover my lost salary and benefits for a few months while I can ramp up putting out more dangerous history and also getting some of these other things up and running, so that I can, match the income I've lost sustainably, and then hopefully, exceed it. And it's just been incredible. This thing's been going for just a couple of weeks. And, I did my research. I've never done a crowdfunding campaign before. I did my research beforehand. One of the things that I discovered is that the vast majority of crowdfunding campaigns fail. And I was worried that mine would go nowhere. I was also worried that I didn't have enough time, because basically I only had a few weeks to try and do it so that I could, step away from the day job before the semester starts. And it's just been absolutely incredible and heartwarming and encouraging that, within a few weeks, I've already exceeded the goal. I could use more, honestly. I'm simultaneously exhilarated and scared. So, please, if you want to help me out, keep chipping in, anybody listening, while the thing's running. I think I'm able to extend it a few days past the end date as well. But yeah, obviously, the more I can squirrel away here, the less terrifying it is to be stepping away from a steady job I've been doing for 15 years. And also, as you said, I've got perks depending on how much someone gives. They get various types of goodies. I made it all like non-physical things because I didn't want to worry about having to send everybody a T-shirt and a coffee cup or whatever. But they're all, non-physical perks. But some of them's pretty cool, including if you give very generously, you can even commission me to make you a, be shared with everybody else too, but make a Dangerous History podcast episode on the topic of your choosing, subject to obviously my approval. If you suggest something that is just like wildly not something for the show to cover, then I'll say, pick something else. But basically, anybody who's been listening to my show for a while, they know the kinds of stuff that I do. So, you can even have your own custom DHP episode. If you give really generously, I'll even make you your own miniseries. So far, no one's taken up on that one yet, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited for this, Prof. CJ, and I think you're a tremendous asset to the Liberty space. But I'm really glad to see you doing this, and I wish you the best of luck. And I always really enjoy our conversations and having you on, and look forward to doing it again in the future. How many episodes do you have planned for this World War I series?
I've done one. I'm gonna definitely do at least 3 more, maybe 4 more. The plan right now for this series is that I'm gonna do an episode on the U.S. government's propaganda operations once America gets into the war. So that's going to be mostly focused around the famous Committee on Public Information, and all the propaganda they did. Then I'm going to do one specifically about the censorship, the various ways that the government, tried to silence and minimize any skeptical voices or any anti-war voices. And then I'm going to do one more about sort of like horizontal propaganda and censorship. So, not the stuff coming top down from the government itself, but, private organizations and individuals and groups and whatever, some of them formal and organized, some of them more kind of ad hoc, because that actually is some of the most disturbing stuff, honestly, where like in some cases there were literal lynch mobs where like an anti-war activist would get beaten half to death or in a few cases even killed. And this was not being done by the government, but the government was kind of, subtly encouraging it and often looking the other way in terms of punishing people for doing these horrible things. So I'm going to do an episode on that. And then I might do an episode all about American academia and how much American academia during World War I, overwhelming majority of American academics became rabid propagandists for the war. Only a very small dissident minority, many of whom suffered for it, spoke out against the war and against the war narrative. So, as it is with Ukraine war now, or most wars ever since World War I, American academia, they're not what you think they are. They're not these bleeding heart liberals. They like to talk that way. They're kind of like Barack Obama, where they like to talk very soft and peacenik sounding. But then, they're they're bombing people or droning people or whatever as much or more as like a John McCain or a George W. Bush. And so, yeah, academics, they're mostly not to be trusted when it comes to war.
You know, I'm usually against war, but this one is special.
Yeah. Well, as you know, from listening to that recent episode I did, there were already British academics during their propaganda who that was their line. That was their line. A lot of them, and then John Dewey and lots of other American academics take the same line once the U.S. is in the war. Right? They go, "Oh, I've always been anti-war. I'm uncomfortable with militarism. Oh, war is just like the worst thing ever." Some of them even flat out call themselves pacifists, and then they go, "But the current war is the total exception. I'm against all the other wars except for the one that's actually happening right now. That one's the magical exception." So yeah that's the move.
All right. Well, looking forward to those other episodes. The links to all this stuff will be libertyweekly.net/222. Also, tomwoods.com/CJ. Prof. CJ, it's been a pleasure. Looking forward to doing it again. Thanks for coming on.
Likewise, I've enjoyed it very much, and thank you.